Welcome to American History 202. Our course begins at the end of the Civil War in an era called the Reconstruction Era. And before we get into that, I want to spend just a couple of minutes on the Civil War. Now, I'm not going to give about the battles, just give me a few minutes here. The Civil War, of course, was known by many different names. Depending on where you lived, what it was called. Now, here in the South, of course, we called it the War for Southern Independence, or Mr. Lincoln's War. In Kentucky, it was known as the Brothers' War. And in the North, it was called the War of Secession, or just the War. Here we see the flags from both the Confederate on the left and the Union on the right with the cross sabers, which of course indicates immediately there is a problem. As I said, our chapter starts with Reconstruction after the war, but I want to go back right now to April the 2nd, 1865, Richmond, Virginia, the capital of the Confederacy. Now this is just a map showing you all of this, of course, is the Southern states, the solid South, which seceded from the Union and formed the Confederacy. This little YouTube is about a minute and a half long, and it'll take you back to April the 2nd, 1865.
Within a few months in the spring of 1865, most of the remaining Confederate Army was pressed into battle in rural Virginia, leaving Richmond largely undefended. Fearing attack, Jefferson Davis ordered an evacuation. Fleeing Confederates set fire to government documents to keep them from falling into Union hands. But the blaze raged out of control.
What people recall is not only the smoke and the fire, but the papers blowing everywhere. That in the street there was paper and paper and more paper.
And most of that paper was money. With its capital city in ashes, the Confederacy faced certain defeat. Its army, desperate for supplies, advanced on a little town called Appomattox, Virginia.
April the 2nd, 1865, as you can see, we're fortunate enough to have actual photographs of this war. And of course, the buildings look like they've been bombarded with cannon shell, but they haven't. All this is devastation from the fires that had been set by the fleeing military. They did not want to leave anything up that the Union could use at all when they came into the city. So on the evening of April the 2nd, the Confederate government had fled the city with the army right behind, as the YouTube said. And on the morning of April the 3rd, blue-coated troops entered the capital. Now, Richmond had been the holy grail for the Union's war effort during the 4 years, and tens of thousands of Yankee soldiers had lost their lives trying to get it, and nearly as many Confederates lost their lives trying to defend it. Now the Yankees came to take possession of their prize. One resident, Mary Fontaine, wrote in her diary as the Yankee troops came marching in, and they're all black. I saw them unfurl a tiny flag, and I sank on my knees, and the bitter tears came in a torrent. Another observer wrote that as the Federals rode into the city, the black residents were completely crazy. They danced and they shouted, and the men hugged each other and women kissed. And among the first forces into the capital were the black troops from the 25th Corps of the Union, along with the 5th Massachusetts Cavalry. Well-dressed, well-mannered, and one of the first things these troops started doing when they came to the city was being polite to everyone and started trying to put out the fires and help anyone that needed help. This is, of course, a picture of their battle flag. The next day, President Abraham Lincoln visited the city, and for the resident of Richmond, these were symbols of a world turned upside down. It was, as one reporter noted, too awful to remember. If it was only possible to erase it, but of course that could not be. Now, Richmond is in shambles, the beautiful city of Richmond. But it wasn't destroyed because of the advancing Union troops. It was destroyed because of the retreating Confederate troops, although devastation had been necessary for a Union victory. But it was the retreating Confederates that had burned everything behind them. The Confederate capital was worthless. Confederate bonds are worthless, and huge sums of money had been spent on the purchase of war material and neglecting any and all of the infrastructure. But as bad as all that was, the worst result was the bitterness and hatred left behind. and more than 20% of the white male Southern population dead. 260,000 white Southerners killed by the same number of white Northerners. Now, like I said, it's not just Charleston that was devastated. Richmond, our own city of Charleston, got their share of it from Sherman's troops when he was marching through Georgia. Abraham Lincoln, president in 1856, of course, was assassinated almost immediately after the Civil War ended by John Wilkes Booth, the actor. Reward poster for him, $100,000 in 1865. Folks, that'd be several million today. They wanted him bad. Now, this is just for your information, and you might want to know more about it. If you do, I've read both of these books, and Bill O'Reilly wrote Killing Lincoln, and yes, that's Bill O'Reilly from Fox News. But he doesn't write anything like he talks on television. He's done an excellent job. And James Swanson also is a very interesting and a quick read, Manhunt, the 12-Day Chase for Lincoln's Killer. My only complaint against Mr. Swanson's book is in his book, he writes as if he knows what John Wilkes Booth was thinking while he was hiding, and I do not believe anyone can know what someone who's been dead for more than 100 years was thinking. But the facts are there. Of course, the main player in Reconstruction is going to be Vice President Andrew Johnson, who is no longer Vice President, but who is now the President. He was a Southerner from Tennessee, and one of the only Southern senator who had stayed in Washington, D.C. when the war was started. And it was hoped that being a Southerner, he would help bring the South back into the fold after the war. It's why he was chosen to run with Lincoln, because he was very definitely a Democrat. He was not a Republican. Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner, leaders of the House of Representatives and Senate, radical Republicans, devout abolitionists, and they're going to be the ones that are going to be leading most of the Reconstruction efforts. So, it's spring of 1865. We have a new president in the White House. The war is over. Slaves are free. And Republicans are ready to rebuild the South. Thus, we begin our journey into the Reconstruction era. Chapter 15. What is freedom? Reconstruction 1865 to 1877. The destruction of slavery, of course, made freedom and its definition central to national life. Was freedom for these former slaves going to be simply negative, which meant the absence of slavery? Or was freedom going to be positive, which would include the rights to civil equality, the right to vote, and even own land? Now, freedom was going to be contested and very contradictory in this time of Reconstruction. Now, African Americans' sense of freedom was rooted in their experience of slavery, knowing only that and what little that they did know of the white society. But freedom to them, above all, meant escaping the horrors and injustices of slavery and enjoying the rights and opportunities of American citizenship. The freed blacks celebrated their new space to do what was denied under slavery. They could now hold meetings and religious services free of white supervision. They could own dogs and guns and buy liquor. They could move freely to find work and family members. And a lot of them moved to the southern cities and even some northern cities, which seemed liberating compared to the rural plantation areas. The black institutions, which had been established under slavery, such as the family and secret slave churches, and even the free black churches and schools, were strengthened and expanded after the war. The family, of course, was very fundamental to post-war black life, as the former slaves sought to find loved ones that had been separated from them by sale. And the widows of the black soldiers who had been fighting for the Union got pensions from the federal government, which finally acknowledged the status of slave marriages. Reconstruction also transformed relationships within the families as the black men and women sought to get their own sphere of free families, with the women spending time at home with the children and cooking, and the men engaged in work outside the home, just like the white folks. Yet poverty compelled many black women to go find wage work. And after the war, most blacks also left white churches and established their own churches, most notably the Methodists and the Baptists, and they grew rapidly. And the church became central to black life, providing an educational, social, and political sphere for the black community. Freed people actively sought to improve themselves through education, which they hoped would allow them to read the Bible, prosper, and participate in politics. And the first black colleges were founded at this time. Inevitably, in a society in which political participation was central to freedom, the former slaves wanted the right to vote. Once the war ended, and even earlier in some parts of the South, free blacks and former slaves had asserted themselves in the public sphere in meetings and petitioning and demanding the right to vote and organize their own political groups and maybe even offer a candidate to run. Blacks now celebrated the 4th of July as a holiday that many white Southerners soon came to shun. Land ownership was at the core of the former slaves' sense of freedom. So by acquiring land, the freed slave hoped to create an economic life and communities beyond white control and interference. Many former slaves believed that they had earned the right to some of the land through their unpaid labor. While the freedman's idea of freedom was similar to that of the white Americans, including self-ownership, family stability, religious liberty, political participation, and, of course, economic independence. But the newly freed men saw freedom as an open-ended process of transformation, not a birthright that could be assumed. So they wanted to own land. They wanted the right to vote, the right to work as a wage earner, and to, above all, get an education. If they had those things, they'd be as good as any white man. This is a picture of the Southern School. And unfortunately, there weren't that many in the beginning educated blacks that could do teaching. So we had white men come down. I know there's a white person in there somewhere. Where is he? Oh, there he is, sitting over here. So we have a white teacher from the north coming down, and you'll see that you've got all ages. You've got children. You've got older people. We've got some older ones back here. The young ones were told by their parents they had to get educated to be able to function as a free man. The middle-aged and the parents wanted to get an education so that they could function better. And of course, the older people wanted to get education so that they could learn to read their Bibles. Now, many Southern whites were, shall we say, dismayed by the defeat in emancipation. It caused enormous destruction and resulted in Northern domination. And while some 260,000 Southern white men had died in the war, more than a fifth of the South's adult white males, the war had destroyed much of the agricultural property on which the Southern economy was based. Plantation-owning families faced enormous changes, having lost their slaves and their life savings, which they had, of course, invested in Confederate government bonds. And with their slaves gone, some actually had to engage in physical labor for the very first time in their lives. Southern planters tried to impose their own version of freedom on the former slave, seeking to regain the old control they had exercised under slavery. Freedom for the planters still meant a hierarchy and mastery. It was a privilege, not a right, and did not mean economic independence or civil or political equality. The Northerners immediately tried to impose their own version of freedom as free labor. Blacks would become wage earners and landowners, just like the free whites in the North. And Northern investors would inject capital and migrants into the South to rebuild the economy. The South would eventually resemble the free society of the North. This was the plan. And conflict was inevitable. The planters wanted a labor system as close to slavery as possible, while the former slaves wanted economic autonomy and access to land. Now, I have down here the white owner was crippled in some way. He could either be physically crippled or financially crippled. Excuse me. Directed by Mr. O.O. Howard, a Maine abolitionist and Civil War general, the Freedmen's Bureau was established by Congress in March of 1865, actually before the war ended, to establish a functioning free labor system in the South. Their agents were asked to establish schools, give aid to the poor and the aged, solve disputes between the whites and the blacks, and ensure equal treatment for the former slaves and white unionists in the courts. Though the Bureau only existed from 1865 to 1870 and never had more than 1,000 agents in the field, it accomplished much and the most in the field of education and health care. But the Bureau had a conflicted legacy in economic affairs. The Bureau believed that sound race relations in the South should rest on fair wages and working conditions, and on opportunities for improvement and social advance. But the freed people wanted land. They didn't want to work for a wage on a plantation. They wanted to own their own land. And the law founding the Bureau enabled the agency to divide abandoned and confiscated land into 40-acre plots for rental and sale to the free people. But in the summer of 1865, a new president, Andrew Johnson, ordered that almost all confiscated land in federal hands be returned to the former owners, in other words, the white Southerners. In South Carolina and Georgia, Army troops forcibly evicted blacks who had been given land by General Sherman, who had promised them 40 acres and a mule. Although blacks protested, no land redistribution occurred, and nearly all the rural freed people stayed poor and propertyless during Reconstruction. They had little choice but to return to work on the plantations, often for their former owners. Black men were confined mostly to farm work, unskilled work, if they could find a job. Black women were restricted to domestic work as cooks and maids, and the wages were too low to build any kind of savings or wealth. And although by 1900 a few of the Southern freed blacks had acquired their own land, it was darn few. So a new labor system was engaged. Excuse me, it's called the task system. It survived in the rice area of South Carolina and Georgia, while supervised wage labor became the norm in the Cotton Belt and much of the tobacco areas of Virginia and North Carolina. Sharecropping. Oh, that word itself. It just looks so darn good on papers. And in theory, it should have worked. But unfortunately, people fail to take into consideration the mental attitude of the former white slave owner. It first developed as a compromise between the blacks' desire for land and the planters' insistence on labor. I have a detail here of what it was, but let me give you an instance. I'm a white plantation owner, and you are a former slave. But maybe not mine, you may have belonged to somebody else, but you're free now. You found your family and your children, and you can't find a job. I've got 1,000 acres out here of land, and I've got nobody to work it. I can't do it. I don't have any children. My son got killed in the war. So I go to you and I offer you a proposition. Okay, I've got the land, you've got the back. Why don't we go together? I won't give you the land. I will allow you to plant the land. I will furnish the seed. You work on it, and at the end of the time, when we have to harvest, we'll split the profits. That sounds pretty good. You could work at your own pace, or you be your own boss. And as a former slave, you go, well, that sounds good, except if I gotta wait until harvest time to get any money, how am I going to feed my kids and wife now? I say to you, okay, I've got a old slave quarter house over here you could have rent free. You could stay in that. And I can make arrangements for the local store to let you charge your groceries and maybe get your kids some shoes and your wife some material for a dress. And then at the end of the season, when we have our harvest, you can take your money and pay for it. Well, that sounds absolutely great. I'm going to have a house that I don't have to pay rent on. I'm going to have food from, I just go into the store and charge what I want. The kids can have candy. I mean, this is fantastic. Sounds like a winning deal. Yes, it does. Except that me, as a plantation owner, I either own that store or I know who does, and you're going to be charged double for everything you buy. And at the end of season, when we harvest, if you have enough to pay off your debt to the store, you're going to be doing good. You might have enough to pay off the debt and have a couple of dollars left, but that's going to be it. So basically, it was legal slavery. So this sharecropping, and they're all the white plantation owners weren't like that. There was some who were decent and actually worked with the new slave because he had never had a charge account before. He'd never had to buy anything before. So of course, it's like a lot of times, unfortunately, the first year of college for students, when they get a credit card, they buy things that they don't need, forgetting that you're going to have to pay this bill at one time or another, or maybe mother's going to pay the bill. But it's so easy to go into a store and say, oh, charge it. I want this or I want that. And I must admit that with my charge card, on occasion, I have bought things I really didn't need, but I wanted them because I could. And that's very bad. So as I've said here, sharecropping becomes increasingly oppressive over time. And as the prices on the southern cotton crops drop, there's even less opportunities for the sharecroppers. The war and its aftermath are also greatly impacted the white farmer who experienced what they thought was a loss of freedom. Now, this is not your plantation owners. This is your Roman farmers, the common everyday grade. They probably didn't even own any slaves. Before the war, most small white farmers had raised food for their families and grown cotton. The war and successive crop failures ruined many farms, and to get supplies from the merchants, they were forced to grow cotton and commit part of their crop as collateral, property the creditor could seize if the debt is not paid, and this became known as a crop lien. There again, they weren't charging per se, but they were, basically that was pretty much the same as your other system of being a sharecropper. Now this just is a map showing you, as you can see, how much of it was sharecropping, the dark green, and you don't see it on the north above the, you just see it in the Confederate States. Due to the rural South's economy suffered, southern cities saw considerable growth in the post-war period. They had new railroad lines allowed the rich merchants to engage in commerce with the North, and a new urban middle class of merchants and railroad entrepreneurs and bankers began to benefit from the expansion of the cotton production. Reconstruction transformed the lives of all Southerners. The antebellum world of master and slave and the independent yeoman farmer had been replaced by a post-war world with a new social class. You had land-owning employers, black and white sharecroppers, white cotton farmers, black wage workers, and urban businessmen. Now, the debates over land, labor, and political power that defined Reconstruction in our country had parallels in other societies that had experienced emancipation. In each case, the planters tried to make the former slaves return to the plantation work to grow the same crops as under slavery, and considered freed black workers as lazy and devoid of ambition. The slaves sought independence. Though owning land to avoid labor is similar to that of slavery or other thought, strategies to escape the white control was very paramount in their minds. And planters attempted to replace freedmen with a new foreign source of labor. Indians in Britain and came in from the Caribbean, and Chinese and the Americans came in from the West. But the United States was, shall we say, unique as a post-slavery society in that it gave freedmen the right to vote, an event that emerged as a result of a struggle between Congress and President Andrew Johnson over the course of Reconstruction. Andrew Johnson. Before we go too much further, let me tell you a little bit about him. He was quite the dude. I don't have all this information here, and I will not ask you questions about it, but I would be willing to bet dollars to donuts most of you have never heard of him. Andrew Johnson was born in North Carolina. And at a very young age, about 12 or 13, his father died and left his mother with 4 children and no way to make money. A decent woman couldn't do anything back in those days. If she worked in a saloon, she would not be a decent woman. We didn't have women teachers at this point in time. Most of the teachers were men. Practically all the teachers were men. A woman could do nothing, maybe housework or indenture herself out as a servant. But she came up with an idea that she could basically sell her son into a form of slavery. She indentured him, the oldest son, Andy, to a tailor. Now, she was paid a certain amount for this. She would have less mouths to feed with him gone. He would be learning a trade, and when he finished his apprenticeship, he would be a qualified tailor and be able to make money. It was a hard decision, but it sounded like a win-win situation. This just left her with 3 small children and a little bit of money that she got from apprenticing her son. Well, Andy was just like any other teenage boy. He was, fun-loving, fun to play jokes, and just all-around little 13, 14-year-old boy. Well, the master tailor was a hard person to please, and he was always wanting to beat him. And if you were my apprentice, I had the right to treat you as a slave. I could beat you, I could have you arrested, I could do anything I want to you during the course of your apprenticeship. You're mine, body and soul. Well, he played a joke on his guy he was apprenticed to, and he learned through the grapevine, so to speak, that his guy he was apprenticed to was going to beat the living tar out of him. So he ran away. Went on further down into South Carolina, and we actually lose track of him for a couple of years. But we do know that by the time he's 19 years old, he comes back to North Carolina. He's finished his apprenticeship somewhere in South Carolina and became a very talented tailor. So he goes back to North Carolina to check on his mother. In fact, that his mother is remarried, no new kids, still just the 3 kids. And he manages to persuade them to leave North Carolina, because as long as he stays in North Carolina, he's got a warrant out for his arrest because he's a runaway apprentice. So I found it so amusing. He persuaded them to leave North Carolina and go into Tennessee. Now, if you've ever been in those mountains between North Carolina and Tennessee, you know they're beautiful, but gosh darn, they're steep. And can you imagine coming down those mountains with a wagon being pulled by a mule who was blind? He had to walk and lead him the entire way. They barely got into Tennessee before they settled, and Andy got involved in politics. He was always for the underdog. He started out in a local little town, and he met a little girl who was the daughter of a local businessman. And he's 19, going on 20 now, and he falls in love with her. And he didn't even learn how to read and write until he was 21 years old, and his new wife helped teach him. He went to the local college to learn a little bit about politics and started getting involved in politics, and started out as an alderman and worked his way up. And he eventually became mayor of the city, and he went on to be state representative and finally governor of the state of Tennessee. Always for the underdog. He'd take cases even if he couldn't be paid. He was a good lawyer, good arguer. And like I say, he knew how to read and write. As a matter of fact, he handmade a suit for Abraham Lincoln for his first inauguration as a gift. So up until this point in time, he's got a good reputation. He's always for the underdog. He's been in politics since he was 18 or 19 years old. He's very definitely a Southerner, although he did not own any slaves. He was a white supremacist. Okay, now this is Mr. Johnson. When the war was declared, as I stated earlier, he stayed. He's the only Southern political representative who stayed in Washington and stayed loyal to the Union. And after the war was over, for a while, he was made governor of Tennessee. And then when Lincoln ran for the second term, they chose him, hoping he would help. They thought that he hated the South. Bad mistake. He didn't hate the South. He hated the big plantation owners who used to make fun of him because he was so old before he learned how to read and write. Of course, he had not gone to the proper colleges. He was not one of their class. You know, he was a poor dirt farmer, basically, just a poor everyday guy that they had no respect for. He hated the rich upper class, not the South. That was a big mistake they made. And so when they offered him the vice presidency, he did accept it. And it's about this time he seems to have taken a turn for I don't know how to say it, but during the Civil War, his personality kind of got a little twisted, and he started drinking extremely heavy. Now, okay. Lincoln's successor to the presidency, Mr. Johnson, was initially responsible for Reconstruction in Tennessee. And I have written, he rose from poverty to a political career in the state politics in Tennessee and represented the U.S. Congress, and where he was governor. Appointed Tennessee's small white farmers. He championed Tennessee's small white farmers. Made enemies of the state's large slave-owning planters. As I said, he was the only senator to stay in the North. Tennessee's military governor after the war. And his vice presidency, the Republicans hoped, would help gain support for the party in the South. Well, number one, as I just said, he was not an emancipationist. He was a racist. He did not have Lincoln's skill at talking. He did not have an ability to compromise. He also was a staunch defender of states' rights. And he argued that since secession was illegal, the southern states had never really left the Union or given up their right to govern their own affairs. They were just being naughty children, basically. And Johnson, while supporting emancipation for a while, was deeply racist and did not believe that the blacks had a role to play any part of it, for his Reconstruction. The problem was, since when he became president, Congress was not in session. He became president in April. And in May of 1865, he started to release proclamations that inaugurated a period that historians now call Presidential Reconstruction, 1865 through 1867. He began offering pardons, which restored political and property rights to the white Southerners, except for the slaves. If you took an oath of office and didn't have the property worth more than $20,000 at that time, nowadays it would be about $150,000. You could be readmitted, and you have your citizenship status returned, and you could be considered a loyal citizen. But if you went to talk to Mr. Johnson, you might be exempted from that rule. Now, for a while, everybody thought he was taking bribes, but when he left the presidency, he didn't have a dime. He began to appoint provisional governors and ordered them to call state conventions. Well, that sounds good. But the people going to the convention were elected by whites only, and they were supposed to establish loyal southern state governments, loyal to the Union. But the new state governments were required only to abolish slavery, repudiate secession, will never succeed again, and of course the Union was going to refuse to pay their Confederate debts. Now, a lot of people in the North at first supported Johnson's plan, and Southern whites mostly returned prominent Confederates and old elites to power, and violence against newly freed people and Northerners in the South generated opposition to Johnson's politics. Now, new state laws in the South, they're called codes, black codes, caused the most opposition to Johnson's Reconstruction policy. And while these laws gave blacks the right to legally marry and own property and have access to the court, in some ways, they denied them rights to testify against a white, to serve on juries or state militias, or vote. They also allowed authorities to arrest and hire out to white landowners any black who refused to sign an annual labor contract, a measure used by the former plantation owners to get the black slaves to return to the plantations. Some states prohibited blacks from buying land and allowed judges to assign black children, take them from their parents, and hire them out without pay or without parental consent. These codes, in effect, to reinstitute conditions of slavery, of course. And here we have a man they're trying to decide, make him decide to vote Democratic, because in the South, the black man was going to belong to the party of Lincoln. But if you got a gun pointed at your head, you're going to vote whatever they tell you to vote. Now, this particular codes, in an effort to reinstitute conditions of slavery, of course, violated the free labor principles of the Republican North and caused many of the North to believe Johnson's policies were encouraging white Southerners to restore their pre-war civil way of life. Of course it was. In December of 1865, President Johnson declared that the establishment of loyal governments in all Southern states had been reunited and the Union was whole again. But radical Republicans in Congress, who've come back by now, coalesced around opposition to Johnson's policies, called for new state governments that would exclude the rebels, exclude them from any kind of elected power, and guarantee the vote to the blacks. These radicals believed that the Union victory presented an opportunity to guarantee equal rights for all despite race. It was a great opportunity. And they welcomed the expanded powers of the federal government and thought federalism and states' rights could not prevent national efforts to secure equal rights for all the citizens. Charles Sumner, a Massachusetts senator, and Thaddeus Stevens, representing Pennsylvania in the House, were the most prominent radicals. We'll see a picture of those people again just in a minute. Stevens, in particular, wanted to confiscate the land of disloyal planters and distribute the land to the former slaves and anybody from the North who wanted to go south. But most members of Congress respected property rights, and they expected to respect them too much to embrace Stevens' land reform proposals, because you'd be setting a very dangerous precedent. If we can take the land away from the man who legally owns it in the South, what's to prevent someone from coming up north and taking the northern landowner's land? You want to be careful of the precedent that you face. Charles Sumner, a Massachusetts senator, and Thaddeus Stevens, representing Pennsylvania in the House, were the most prominent radicals. Oh, I didn't realize I had that in there twice. I must have considered it important to put it in there twice. Thaddeus Stevens on the left and Charles Sumner on the right. Sumner was beaten in the head. If you took the first part of the course, you know that at the end, Charles Sumner was attacked in the Senate. Stevens, he looks like he's been sucking on a lemon, doesn't he? Man, he looks sourpussy. Although Republicans had an overwhelming majority in Congress, the South, of course, had no representation, but the Republican Party was divided, and radicals were only a minority. But they were a noisy minority. Now, most Republicans were moderates who thought Johnson's plan only needed a little bit of improvement. These moderates believed that Southern and Northern whites would never accept black suffrage, and moderates and radicals refused to see any Southerner elected to Congress, but the moderates made sure that Southern governments remained. So they elected people to go to the federal, and not going to work. Moderates extended the life of the Freedmen's Bureau and proposed a civil rights bill which defined all persons born in the United States as equal citizens and spelled out rights that they enjoyed regardless of their race. Equality before the law was central to the bill, making it impossible for states to have laws like the Black Codes that discriminate against blacks. Free labor values also informed the bill, which prohibited laws denying citizens' rights to make contracts, to bring lawsuits, or enjoy protection of personal liberty. The bill said nothing of black suffrage, and Johnson shocked the Congress by vetoing both bills. He claimed he was defending states' rights and that the blacks did not deserve citizenship. And Johnson's vetoes alienated a lot of people in the Republican Party. And later, in April of 1866, the Civil Rights Bill became the first major law in U.S. history to be passed over a presidential veto. Congress soon created its own Reconstruction plan. Its Civil Rights Bill became the basis of the 14th Amendment, which placed in the Constitution the principle of citizenship for all persons born in the United States and empowered the federal government to protect the rights of all Americans. The amendment banned the states from abridging the privileges and immunities of citizens or denying them the equal protection of law, regardless of your race. This language allowed future Congress and federal courts to give meaning to this promise of legal equality. As a compromise between moderate and radical Republicans, this amendment did not grant black suffrage, but it did stipulate that any state that denied voting rights to any group of people, men, would face a reduction in their representation in Congress. Now, emancipation also threatened the South's political power because now all freed blacks, not just 3/5, would be counted in determining a state's representation in Congress. And this 14th Amendment offered the white South's political leadership a choice. Allow black men to vote and keep your representation, or limit the vote to whites and lose power in Congress. The 14th Amendment created great conflict between the parties. Not one Democrat voted for it, and only 4 Republicans opposed it. So while radicals deplored that it did not give blacks a vote, the amendment made legal equality regardless of a race a basic right of all American citizens. Another brief little Reconstruction YouTube.
The Southern legal system became an instrument of intimidation. Louisiana, Texas, South Carolina, Mississippi, and Florida passed laws that virtually prohibited freedmen from any work except as field hands. The laws were called Black Codes. The aim was slavery without the chain.
The Black Codes were laws passed to control and restrict and constrain the lives of the freed people, essentially rendering them bondsmen again under law.
Some states made it illegal for freedmen to handle weapons and restricted them from buying or renting land. Black children could be seized from poor families and forced to work in the fields. If a black man had no job, he could be jailed and auctioned to a planter for his labor.
They make a travesty of the freedom that African Americans have acquired. They are so far from any notion of fairness or freedom that even Northerners who are not egalitarians say these laws are unacceptable. And so Northern Republicans are faced with a dilemma. They don't want to have a big fight with the president, but to accept the idea that Johnson's policy is a success and accept the Black Codes, they feel means giving up the victory in the Civil War.
To Louisiana's black veterans, one freedman offered this advice: I would say to every colored soldier, bring your gun home. In December 1865, the 39th Congress the first since the end of the Civil War, convened in Washington. More than 60 former Confederates prepared to take their seats, including 4 generals, 4 colonels, and 6 Confederate cabinet officers. Even Alexander H. Stephens, the former vice president of the Confederacy, expecting, as one observer put it, to govern the country he had been trying to destroy.
If the South is going to rise again, so to speak, control its own political life, control the free people, indeed, if ex-Confederates themselves are going to be allowed back into leadership at the national level, then to so many white Northerners it seemed like the war would have been fought in vain.
On the opening day, the clerk of the House refused to announce the names of the Southern delegates in his roll call. The former Confederates were denied their elected seats and sent packing. The fight for control of Reconstruction had begun.
In many ways, Congress was a poisoned atmosphere in the debates over the Reconstruction policy. There were raw war memories being played out. There were visceral hatreds being played out on the floor of Congress between Republicans and Democrats. These debates are between men who have experienced this war, who have fought this war. They are fighting literally about the meaning of that conflict they have just fought.
Northern Democrats sided with Johnson and railed against Republicans across the aisle. Washington must get out of the way, they insisted, and let Southerners run their own affairs.
The Democrats had always identified themselves as the party of the white man. They very explicitly said, we are here to protect the rights of men, North and South. And how do we do that? We hold the Union together. For that reason, the Democrats saw themselves as trying to put North and South together as quickly as possible during the Civil War, and as soon as it's over, trying to knit North and South together at the expense of black men.
At one point in the debates, Thaddeus Stevens stood up and, answering his Democratic colleagues, says, "Do not, I pray, admit those who have slaughtered 500,000 of our countrymen until their clothes are dried and until they are reclad. I do not wish to sit side by side with men whose garments smell of the blood of my kindred." It was Stevens' way of saying, we're going to keep the South out of the Union as long as we can, and we're not going to allow anybody back in here who was responsible for making the war.
A congressional committee on Reconstruction concluded that Southern governments were unable to keep law and order or stem violence against African Americans. Allowing Southern states unchecked power so soon after the war, the committee said, was madness and lunacy. Moderate Republicans had hoped to persuade Johnson to provide minimal protections for blacks in the South. Now, even they were growing impatient with the president's policies. In March 1866, both houses of Congress passed a landmark civil rights bill that protected the rights of American citizens without regard to race. Republicans warned Johnson not to veto the bill if he hoped for any continued cooperation with Congress. 2 weeks later, Johnson vetoed the civil rights bill.
Johnson is opposed to the granting of those types of protections to black people. This had not been done for the white immigrants who would come to America. Why then are you doing it for these black people?
Moderate Republicans were outraged.
Johnson was stubborn, self-righteous, rigid in thinking. He was really the worst person possible to become president accidentally at a time when flexibility, vision, and creative leadership were really what was required.
Moderate Republicans are forced into the radical camp because they had to oppose Andrew Johnson. Johnson's plan of Reconstruction was so lenient, in utter contempt of black liberty, that was simply unacceptable.
A united Republican Party overrode Johnson's veto. America had its first Civil Rights Act. But many in Congress argued that the act was not enough, that safeguarding civil rights required changes to the Constitution itself. Republican leaders proposed a new amendment.
The 14th Amendment becomes the crux of the political battle in 1866. And basically, what they put into the Constitution is a new definition of American nationality and citizenship, making African Americans for the first time full citizens of the United States. This is the origin of the concept of civil rights in American society. Rights which obtain to you as a citizen, which cannot be rescinded because of your race.
This is a titanic debate about just what the authority of the federal government is going to be. There were plenty of Americans who argued the federal government had no right to declare black people citizens.
The Democrats are constantly putting forward racist arguments. You are eradicating a line between black and white which has existed forever. To Republicans, what's at stake here really is the definition of freedom. If a person can be discriminated against in every walk of life because of their race, has slavery really been abolished?
Congress overwhelmingly passed the 14th Amendment, but it had to be ratified by 3/4 of the states. The president denounced the amendment and accused the Republicans of treason.
Johnson is opposed to an expansion of federal power. For him, constitutional authority resides at the state level, not at the national level. And Johnson believes that the Republicans are engaged in an enormous usurpation of state authority.
The lines were drawn.
I apologize. I am recording this at home, and my puppy dog doesn't like people. She's at the window now because the weather's gorgeous. This may seem a little bit repeating of what you've gone through, but let's do it anyway. The 1866 elections revolved around the 14th Amendment, and Johnson urges voters to elect men to Congress who supported his policies and claimed that the radical Republicans were plotting to assassinate him. This, along with riots in southern cities targeting blacks, undermined support for Johnson's allies, and Republican opponents emerged victorious in the election. But every southern state except Tennessee refused to ratify the 14th Amendment. Johnson and the White South's resistance pushed moderate Republicans into the radical camp, as he stated in the YouTube. And in March of 1967, Congress passed something called the Reconstruction Act, which temporarily divided the South into 5 military districts and called for the establishment of new state governments in which black men could vote. This inaugurated the period of radical Reconstruction lasting until 1877. Now, Congress simultaneously approved a measure prohibiting the president from removing certain members of his cabinet without the Senate's consent. And Johnson believed this was unconstitutional and it limited his authority. And it was. But, you know, when you're a politician. And when he fired Secretary of War Edward Stanton, a radical ally, the House approved articles of impeachment, sending charges against Johnson to the Senate, which was to decide his fate. This was the first time a president had faced trial in the Senate for high crimes and misdemeanors. Now, not all Republicans supported impeachment, and Johnson indicated that he would halt his interference with Congress' Reconstruction policy if they would, stop. He barely escaped impeachment. I should have had this one first. Okay, I got them backwards. Okay, this is just what I just got through saying. Another short one, folks. It's all 2 minutes long, I think.
We've had a number of potential nannies come through already.
Meet Mr. Hughes.
Hey guys, welcome to Hip News History. We're so glad that you could make it because I'm about to serve up some Andrew Johnson on a platter of impeachment. That's right, guys. Only 2 United States presidents have ever been impeached. And considering I already did the Clinton impeachment, I figure why not make a series of it all? This is the perfect lecture if you're in high school, but certainly middle school, college, old person's home, cray. We don't care why you're here. We're glad that you made it. So here we go, guys. Let's see if we can throw you a strike. Hey, Abraham Lincoln, what y'all thinking? Abraham Lincoln's a Republican, Andrew Johnson's a Democrat. So you should begin with that fact, the idea that Andrew Johnson is no best friend of the Republican Party. But what he does represent to Abraham Lincoln in the election of 1864 is the idea that Abraham Lincoln is fighting the Civil War to save the Union. So maybe as a gesture to moderates or a gesture to pro-Union Southerners, he chooses a Democrat, someone from another Johnson, who was a senator from Tennessee, to be on the ticket with him, right? And it seemed like a great idea at the time. And whether or not that helped him win the election of 1864 is another man's question. But right now, I do know that Abraham Lincoln's about to go down. And of course, I'm talking about the assassination by John Wilkes Booth. And suddenly, here's Andrew Johnson, a Southern Democrat, in charge of the government. All right, so even before we can take a look at Andrew Johnson being a Southern Democrat and his problems with Congress, we should point out that Abraham Lincoln, a Republican, had problems in his own political party. And of course, if you've seen the Steven Spielberg movie Lincoln, this shows this off great when they're trying to pass the 13th Amendment during the Civil War, and you see the more moderate Republicans, the Republicans that are more interested, maybe a little bit more interested in economics and saving the Union rather than freeing the slaves, is brought to light with their differences with the radical Republicans, namely under Thaddeus Stevens. And if you want to read about a really cool cat, read about Thaddeus Stevens. So Abraham Lincoln is already having a problem with these guys as he seeks a Reconstruction that would be a little bit more lenient than the radicals would want. Let's put it that way. Lincoln is looking at re-entering the southern states with like a 10% loyalty oath. He's really looking at not really protecting the freedmen's rights the way that the radical Republicans would like. And certainly there's other differences going on there. But nevertheless, bam, now that Abraham Lincoln has passed, you have Andrew Johnson. And originally it was thought that here's a guy that we can work with. But really quickly, they find out it's not somebody they can work with. Andrew Johnson begins to veto civil rights legislation. He begins to object to the congressional radical Republicans' idea of really controlling the Southern governments through military occupation. And certainly he's not going to be for the 14th Amendment. So here we go. We got some rough hands on deck. We're about to have a fight of ruin. All right, so Edwin Stanton, that's the guy's name you're going to have to remember. How many names am I going to make you remember? Only a few. But this is the Secretary of War, Stanton, for Abraham Lincoln. And he's an academic. He's much more of a managerial type of military leader as a Secretary of War than somebody who's really wearing a uniform, let's put it that way. And he certainly believes in the anti-slavery ideas, and he certainly believes that this war was fought and it needs never to have to be fought again. So he's looking at a radical Reconstruction approach to occupation, a big role for the Secretary of War in Reconstruction days, right? He sees the right to vote in the future of the freedmen, and certainly this is not something that Andrew Johnson believes in. So, first of all, Andrew Johnson is already going through his own kind of trials and tribulations as a Republican. In 1866, he goes on something called the Swing Around the Circle, like a big presidential push, kind of a tour that goes from Washington to like New York and Buffalo, Cleveland, kind of a that circle idea. And it's really the first time that a sitting president's going out and campaigning. And I think that turned a lot of people off, them kind of complaining and saying that this was beneath the dignity of the President of the United States. And even though the circle, which is meant really for the midterm elections are always really important, he's looking to get moderate Republican and Democratic voices, Northern Democrats, in the government to support his moderate Reconstruction ideas. But the circle backfires. And after a couple digs that went okay, I think it was in Cleveland where I read that radical Republicans had planted people in the audience, and one of the more famous reported stories was that somebody kind of yelled out, "Hang him, hang Jeff Davis!" The former Confederate presidency. That would be a radical Republican position, right? Punch him where it hurts, hang the former leader. And I think that Johnson replied, "Why don't you hang Thaddeus Stevens?" Don't! Didn't go over so well. Probably hang a radical Republican. There were some claims of not being sober, and there was a disaster, I believe. I want to say Cleveland, but I'm not exactly positive. No, Pennsylvania, Johnstown, where I believe like 200 people fell off a platform before the train got there into a ditch, and the train kept going. The reports aren't well. So Johnson is really having a problem in his popularity, and in the midterm elections that backfire results in radical Republicans taking over Congress in the Senate and in the House. So here he is having to work with these guys, and he's got a plan, and the plan involves firing that Stanton. We're going to get rid of him. And here we have Congress knowing he going to get rid of him. So with that idea in mind, and this is really, I think, the theme or the thesis of this impeachment, it's a political impeachment. It's not because the president so much violated the law, high crimes and misdemeanors, but the congressional legislative branch disagrees with the views that the executive branch has on legislation and constitutionality. So the Senate and the House approve a bill. It's called the Tenure of Office Act. You want vocab? There's your vocab for you kiddies. The Tenure of Office Act basically said to the president that you're not allowed to fire a cabinet member without seeking Senate approval. It's like a post-Senate consent. So basically the Tenure of Office Act says that you're not allowed to fire a cabinet member without seeking Senate approval. And Johnson's all like, I don't like this. So he actually first looked for a loophole. He doesn't want a direct confrontation right away. So what he does is he waits for Congress to go on recess in August of, I guess it would be August of '67, and basically suspend Stanton, because I guess that was in the bill. He could suspend the cabinet member, and during that time he appointed General Grant. And when Grant goes to fulfill his seat, basically there's all this politicalness, and Grant withdraws from that situation. I believe that he even asked General Sherman to fill in and to be the new Secretary of War, but he didn't want the politics of it all anyway. At the end of the day, when Congress comes back, right, now we have a situation on our hands because Stanton returns, and Stanton goes into his office. He was suspended, and now that suspension is over. In his mind, Congress is in session. He shows up for work. So what does Johnson do at this point? He hires Lorenzo Thomas, another major general in the Army. And this guy goes in and basically says to Stanton, "You're fired. Here you go. I'm the new guy. Get out of town." And Stanton refuses to go. First, he wanted to arrest Lorenzo Thomas. And then he realized that if he arrested him, he was setting up a constitutionality argument by getting the law involved. And therefore, you wouldn't have an impeachment trial. You'd have a Supreme Court case about the constitutionality of the Tenure of Office Act. And I'm telling you, the Tenure of Office Act is unconstitutional. Andrew Johnson, in a sense, is in the right here. So at the end of the day, this is awesome. Stanton barricades himself in his cabinet office. He I ain't going nowhere. What you gonna do when they come for you? Well, what's gonna happen is, a couple days later, I'm getting dates wrong, guys, but we're like in January of 68 by this point. Maybe it's February. But nevertheless, Congress enacts articles of impeachment, 11 articles of impeachment. And I've seen some posts where some people are like, the president's never been impeached. Impeachment doesn't mean removal. Impeachment means we think you did something bad, high crimes and misdemeanors, and we're going to ship you off to the Senate. So he's indicted on 11 articles of impeachment, all of them revolving around the idea that you violated the law being the Tenure of Office Act, which is a political law. Go figure. $35.19, kiddies. You want some numbers? There's some numbers for you. That's the total in the vote when the Senate, at the end of the trial, voted to acquit Andrew Johnson. One vote, baby. One vote. You need 2/3 majority. Accusing a math man, but if you take the 35-19, it ain't 2/3. You need one more. It needed to be 36-18. And interestingly, 7 senators were Republicans that voted against getting rid of what would be the Democratic, in a sense, Andrew Johnson, even though he's got an R next to his name. And there were some charges of patronage and bribery and things along those lines. But nevertheless, it's a really quick trial. It was like 2 or 3 weeks, in and out, baby. And I think the precedent here, though, is that you don't want to indict a president based on political reasons. Because he doesn't agree with me politically, we're going to get you, sucker. Because then you're setting up a precedent that's going to probably happen every 8 years. So there you go, guys, right? The impeachment of Andrew Johnson. You got some numbers, you got some names, you got some great vocab, and you have the idea that impeachment really should be reserved for something that's high crimes and misdemeanors, something that's not political, but something where the president truly breaks the law that rises to the idea that we should remove them from office. There we go, we're done. That was painless. That didn't hurt too much, did it? Make sure you get the very basics down, right? You get the names, you get the vocab, you get the numbers. And
What a dude, huh? Sometimes it's, you need a break. And I'm sure you've been in college long enough to realize that every teacher has their own style of teaching. And believe it or not, Hugh Johnson is a teacher. But he does give you all this information and in a rather interesting way. But from that, you do need to remember what the Tenure of Office Act was and the fact that it was a political attempt to get rid of a president over the firing of Secretary of War Edward B. M. Stanton. And by the way, those of you who may not remember, and this is just another one of those FYI things, Stanton was also nearly killed when it was the assassination plot to kill Lincoln. Of course, it involved Stanton, Grant, Johnson, and of course Lincoln. And the only one that was successful was, of course, with Lincoln, because Johnson was in a hotel room. They had no security, and the guy knocked on the door and turned around and ran. Grant left town early, and Stanton was home in bed with a broken collarbone, and they nearly got him killed too. But anyway, you won't need to know that. Republicans nominated Ulysses S. Grant for the president to run against Horatio Seymour, the Democratic candidate and former New York governor in the 1868 election. You see, the sitting president was not nominated to run again. And Reconstruction was the issue of the elections. Republicans tarred the Democrats with secession and treason, a tactic called waving the bloody shirt, while Democrats denounced Reconstruction as unconstitutional and made racist appeals, arguing that black suffrage violated American political system. Grant, of course, won the presidential contest by a very slim margin, and Republicans responded in February of 1869 by adopting the third and final Reconstruction Amendment, the 15th. And this barred federal and state governments from denying the right to vote to any citizen based on race. Denounced by Democrats, the amendment was ratified in 1870. The 15th Amendment enabled states to make suffrage restrictions not based on race, such as literacy tests and property requirements and the poll taxes. And it did not give the right to vote to women, but it represented the culmination of abolition. So you need to know what the 13th Amendment was, which abolished slavery. The 14th Amendment made the newly freed people black citizens, men and women. And the 15th Amendment gave the men the right to vote. Reconstruction laws and amendments reflected the power of the new national state and the idea that citizens should enjoy legal equality. They were, in the words of one Republican, a great constitutional revolution. It transformed the federal system in the language of American freedom. Where before the Civil War, citizenship had been bounded by race, now it's not going to be. But Reconstruction laws rejected that notion that citizenship was reserved only for whites. A guarantee of legal equality affected the discriminatory laws in all states, North and South. This made Congress an instrument by which vulnerable minorities could make claims for freedom and against government's misconduct at all levels. So as I said, the new amendments changed the relationship between states and the federal government. And many important 20th century court decisions were going to be based on the 14th Amendment, such as the 1954 Brown v. Board of Education, really outlawing of segregated schools. This is just a presidential map showing you the pink areas are Republican. The green areas, I find that hard to believe that, Oregon, New York, I'm not surprised that Georgia and Louisiana are Democrat, but, strange. The solid brown is territories non-voting, and the yellow is not voting due to Reconstruction. They haven't been admitted back to states yet. But Reconstruction kind of recast the boundaries of American freedom, and exclusions that had limited citizenship and its privileges to white men had long denied Americans democratic practice. Even Republicans committed to universal rights did not want to extend rights to all races, like the Indians. Some Republicans, like Frederick Douglass and Charles Sumner, wanted to end discrimination against Asians in the nation's immigration law. And when in 1870 Sumner tried to strike the word white from naturalization requirements, Western state senators made Africans eligible for naturalization, but barred Asians from becoming naturalized citizens. So up into the 20th century, Asian immigrants could not become citizens, while their children who were born in this country became citizens automatically. Women's rights. They hoped for expansion of federal powers at a time for women to be able to vote, but it's not going to happen. Here you have a delegate of advocates and women's suffrage addressing the House. They were very vocal, but it was usually the upper class, white and black women, the educated, that had the time. I mean, if you're living on a farm out in South Carolina or Kentucky somewhere, you haven't got time to take off. You're out there busy building homes and growing crops and taking care of kids. You haven't got time to go to town and do all this. You have to have people who help you on the farm. Demands for suffrage, of course, got no support. And the women's rights had discovered the limits of Reconstruction. They saw the expansion of federal power and rights as a moment to advance women's equality, but their demands, especially the demand for them to vote, found little support among the male politicians. Even among radical Republicans who had considered Reconstruction an opportunity to benefit black men. The 14th and 15th Amendments specifically benefited men, not women, and caused a division within the feminist camp and between feminists and radical Republicans. Some, like Elizabeth Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, opposed the 15th Amendment because it did not enfranchise women. They tried to sever women's rights from abolition and even appealed to racism to demand rights for women. Other abolitionist feminists, such as Abby Kelly and Lucy Stone, we'll get more into these a little bit later, argued that the Reconstruction Amendments were limited, where advances toward universal suffrage should be supported. And these two sides split, one group becoming the National Women's Suffrage Association, representing the former, and the American Women's Suffrage Association, representing the latter. The National Women's Association wanted a federal law giving women the right to vote, where the American Women's Suffrage wanted a state law. Despite drawing the boundaries of freedom and gender, Reconstruction marked the only society in the world in which emancipation had been allowed by the extension of citizenship rights to former slaves. So we had a feather in our cap for that one. The tokenism of freedom. The Reconstruction Act sparked great political activity among former slaves in the South, who began to hold mass meetings and even went on strike and tried to desegregate public transportation. Thousands of Southern blacks joined the Union League, an organization tied to the Republican Party, and the vast majority of eligible black voters registered to vote. In the words of one former slave turned political leader, blacks had heard the tokenism of freedom. The Union League, it's hard to find information about the Union League. It had a lot of good and had a lot of bad. In some areas of the South, especially, the Union League was used to train militarily the black citizens. it was supposed to be set up to teach them how to be citizens and how to vote, but sometimes they got out of hand. By 1870, all former Confederate states had been readmitted to the Union, and most were under Republican control. The new state constitutions, drafted in 1868 and 69, and in conventions with substantial black representation, were a vast improvement over the old state constitutions. They created state-funded systems of free public education and penitentiaries and orphan asylums and insane asylums where none had existed before. They guaranteed equality of civil and political rights and abolished the antebellum practices such as whipping as a criminal punishment. Property qualifications for office holding and imprisonment for debt were also eliminated. Though blacks were the majority of most new Republican voters, white Republicans controlled the state Republican parties and held most political offices. Only in our state of South Carolina, with a high percentage of blacks in the population, had a majority black legislature. But the 2,000 African Americans who held public office in Reconstruction represented a radical shift of power in the South. 2 blacks were even elected to the U.S. Senate. 14 were elected to the U.S. House of Representatives, and 1 even served as the first black governor in Louisiana, briefly. Many blacks served in state legislatures, and more blacks than ever held lower offices such as sheriff or tax assessor and policeman, and most all were former slaves. Got a little bit ahead of myself again, didn't I? The new state's government also empowered new groups of whites. And most of them, well, not most of them, a great many of them were Northerners who had come to the South after the war and were former soldiers. Opponents called them carpetbaggers, implying that they packed their possessions in a suitcase that looked like a carpet and quickly moved to the South to gain the spoils of office. While a lot of them were corrupt, there were some who were good, and some of the former Union officers decided to stay after the war, and they did try to help. But so many of them were, well, corrupt is a nice way to put it. They invested in land and railroads seeking economic opportunity, and we have several documented cases where a carpetbagger had come to the South and got a job in public office, and we'd been paid $1,000 a year, yet when he left a year later, he took with him $50,000 because he took the tax money for the local citizens. Yet there were some who came as teachers, and entrepreneurs, and the Freedmen's Bureau brought a lot of them into the South to help the former slaves. Most white Republicans were from the South and were despised by the former Confederates, who saw them as a treacherous scallywag. And when I grew up, my grandmother used to say the word scallywag in a soft whisper. To her, it was the worst thing you could possibly call someone, a scallywag. A few were wealthy whites, but most were non-slave-holding small white farmers from the southern upcountry. Many had been Unionists during the war or hoped Reconstruction government would pass laws favorable to helping the indebted farmers. The Reconstruction's greatest accomplishment was establishing state-supported public schools that served both black and white children, although usually in segregated schools. They also passed civil rights laws that made it illegal for railroads, hotels, and other institutions to discriminate by race. Some states also strengthened the economic power of rural blacks by passing laws favoring agricultural workers and sharecroppers. But Reconstruction governments did not try to promote economic prosperity through land distribution, as a lot of the blacks had hoped they would, but rather tried by developing railroads, which they hoped would spur industrialization and urbanization and diversify their agriculture. Every southern state tried to finance railroad construction and attract industry through tax and subsidy policies. But a revitalized southern economy failed to take. Nevertheless, radical Reconstruction transformed the South by empowering poor whites, northern migrants, and former slaves. The South's traditional leadership, the planters, the merchants, and the Democratic politicians, condemned the new governments as corrupt and inefficient examples of black supremacy. But corruption had existed in Reconstruction governments. It was not confined to a single race, region, or party. The rapid growth of the state budgets allowed many to enrich themselves at public expense. But corruption was greatest elsewhere in the whiskey ring involving Grant's administration officials and New York's infamous Tweed ring controlled by Democrats, raising, where's that? Oh, no, we're not there yet. They were hoping to raise the poor blacks who had initially supported the Republicans but had bolted at the Democrats when their economic situation did not approve. Southern whites opposed Reconstruction primarily because they could not accept the fact that blacks would vote, hold political office, or enjoy any kind of legal equality. They thought Reconstruction should be overthrown in order for white supremacy to return and planters to have a disciplined and dependable workforce. Now, violence was endemic in the Reconstruction era South, in some states more than others. At first, it was local and unorganized, with blacks being assaulted and murdered for refusing to make way for whites on sidewalks or trying to purchase land. But the establishment of Republican state governments after 1867 ignited organized campaigns of violence against supporters of radical Reconstruction. Secret societies, most notably the Ku Klux Klan, tried to prevent blacks from voting and tried to destroy the Republican Party by assassinating local leaders and public officials. The KKK, a terrorist organization, started in 1866 in Tennessee that soon spread throughout the South. And it functions as a kind of military arm of the Democratic Party in that region, and in many counties it started a reign of terror against black and white Republican leaders and people who were disenrolled, but blacks were especially targeted. Now, I'm going to stop there just for a minute. Now, I've got some information I want to give you about the KKK. I know that you all have heard of it. To my knowledge, I don't think there's any. Well, there might be some clans here in South Carolina, but I have not been made aware of it. I know that in my state of Kentucky, there are still some clans, especially down in the southwestern era. The KKK has a very bad reputation. But it wasn't always that way. It didn't start out that way. Okay, think for just a minute. It's after the Civil War. We have states who have not been allowed to be reunited. They don't have their citizenships back. They can't carry guns. They can't get a job. And you have a lot of your Southerners who were officers, especially in the Civil War, who are college-educated young men. They've got nothing to do. Their farms or plantations are destroyed. They can't get a job. They can't vote. What do young people do when there's nothing for them to do? They usually get in trouble. There's a group in southwestern Tennessee who decided that they get together in the evenings and meet at a judge's house, and they drink their bourbon or their beer or whatever they had to drink, and they talk, and pretty soon their group got to be kind of big, and they thought, well, what we need to do is form a club, make it official. So they made arrangements to take over an abandoned plantation out at the edge of town, and they'd meet out there about once a week and do what young men do when they get together. They built a bonfire, and they had a party, and they played cards, and they sang, and they drank, and had a gay old time. Well, they decided to give themselves a name, and they had to, being college educated, they came up with a Greek name, Ku Klux Klan, which strictly means a circle of friends. And this is all they were doing. But at this time in our history, people were superstitious. And the newly freed black man had reason to be afraid. He was very superstitious. And sometimes when they would be driving down the road at night, and they'd look up on this hill where this abandoned plantation was, and they would see figures dancing. Look, have you ever taken a light, put behind your hand, and made a figure on the wall for your children, or had it done for you? And so they were frightened. And it didn't take very long before the town fathers realized that on the nights at this men's club, the KKK got together, the black folks stayed off the street. They didn't go to their union meetings, and they didn't cause any problem. They just stayed put. So maybe we could use this to our advantage to get these freed people back under control. So they contacted their local group and said, we'd like to have you do a little bit more. And in the beginning, they did not hurt anybody. They did not switch anybody. They did not hang anybody. One of the favorite things they liked to do, because they all dressed alike, and they'd all get on these horses, and they'd ride into a small town, 15, 20, or even 50 of them. And they'd all be dressed in the same thing. They didn't have hoods on at this time. And they'd very military. They'd walk to the center of town on their horses and stop. And then without saying a word, the entire group would turn a quarter. And they'd stand there and stare that way for a few seconds, and they'd turn the other way, wait a few seconds, and then they would go back out of town. They hadn't said anything. They hadn't done anything. But the very idea that there's this many men together, what are they up to? It scared the heck out of the people in town. And sometimes, and we have documentation, there were places in Texas when these people would arrive, not doing anything, the townspeople would start shooting at them, and sometimes the townspeople would shoot themselves, and it's just a hassle. And the Klan would ride back out of town basically and stop and sit there and laugh at how the confusion that they caused. And they'd sometimes ride up to a black man who was in the field and ride up real fast and stop his horse and ask for water. I'm the ghost of a Confederate soldier, and throw down a pumpkin or something. Never laid a hand on them, but they were terrifying them. Well, of course, it didn't take long before word of this intimidation by this group spread, and they were all over Tennessee and down into Georgia and Alabama and Louisiana. And in the course of it, someone got the idea that we need to organize them. So they got hold of a former Confederate general named Nathan Bedford Forrest out of Mississippi and said, would you organize? And he did organize. And it was because of him that they started doing the things with the horses, and he never supported violence. He did not support the killing and the whipping. He went along with intimidation. He was a racist. He did believe that whites were superior to blacks, but he did not go along with the killing. But then when the organization spread into the other states and other people took control, that's when it got really violent. And they started, anybody that I don't like in the neighborhood, it doesn't have to do, they don't have to be black, they don't have to be a scallywag or a carpetbagger. If I don't like them, we'll take the Klan out there and talk to them. And it didn't matter if you were black or white. Sometimes they would just issue a warning, but more than likely they would whip you or hang you or do really bad things. Well, about this time, General Forrest, I heard about it, and he decided to disband the official organization, the KKK. So the official organization, KKK, was disbanded in 1869. It'd only been going for about 3 years. Now the other groups took new names like white radicals, white supremacists, white, they call themselves flowers sometimes, night riders sometimes. They call themselves all different kind of names, and usually said that we were part of the KKK, but the KKK had officially disbanded. Their bylaws and their paraphernalia that they wore was all destroyed, and everyone sworn to secrecy. So that in itself is what happened. I'm not saying the KKK is not bad, and it is bad now, but it came to resurgence again during World War I. But the official KKK, and your Encyclopedia Britannica and your websites will tell you that Nathan Bedford Forrest started it. He did not start it. He was asked to organize it, and he did do that. Now this is supposed to be some, as you can see, there's no consistency right here on how they're dressed. The Southern governments could not suppress the KKK. And in 1870 and 1871, Congress adopted something called the Enforcement Act that outlawed terrorist groups and allowed the president to use the army against them, and defined the acts that deprived citizens of civil and political rights as federal crimes. President Grant dispatched the federal marshals and troops to suppress the KKK, and by 1872, most areas of the South were peaceful. Not really. That's a misconception. The groups were gone, but individual acts of terrorism were still done. Now, the Northerners' commitment to Reconstruction started to decline in the 1870s. Radicals such as Thaddeus Stevens had passed away or otherwise left politics, and they were replaced by figures less dedicated to equal rights for the blacks. Northerners more and more felt the South should solve its own problems. We can't continue to get the federal government involved. And many in the North believed that now that the national government had freed the slaves, made them citizens, give them a vote, blacks had to depend upon themselves. In 1872, a very influential group of Republicans, angered by the corruption in the Grant administration, and believing that federal power needed to be reduced, formed their own party, calling themselves the Liberal Republicans. They nominated Horace Greeley, editor of the New York Tribune, for president. And they repeated the Democratic criticism of radical Reconstruction as encouraging corruption and preventing the rule of the best men in the South, the region's natural leaders. Democratic leaders embraced the Republican split and endorsed Greeley. But many rank-and-file Democrats could not stomach Greeley, a former Whig and Republican, and Grant won a second term to the presidency by a large margin. But nevertheless, the liberal Republicans and Democrats in the North could now agree on one thing: roll back Reconstruction. Northern critics stepped up their openly racist attacks on the Southern governments as dens of corruption and misgovernment ruined by black rule. Then a severe depression beginning in 1873 distracted the Northern Republicans from the Southern issues. Democrats were very successful in 1874 elections and took control of the House of Representatives. But before the new Congress met, legislatures passed the Civil Rights Act of 1875, which barred racial discrimination in public accommodations such as hotels and theaters. The Supreme Court also signaled a retreat from Reconstruction in the Slaughterhouse case in 1873, in which it held that the federal government could not effectively protect the legal and civil rights of individuals in states, effectively mitigating the 14th Amendment. By the mid-1870s, Reconstruction was under serious assault. Democrats regained control of the states with large white voting majorities, and in Tennessee and North Carolina and Texas, and they called themselves redeemers because they had redeemed the white South from corruption and misgovernment and Northern and black control. Violence flared in states where Reconstruction governments persisted, and the Grant administration now refrained from protecting the besieged governments and Republicans. In 75 and 76, armed Democrats on Election Day simply destroyed ballots and drove blacks away from the polls. They took the states of Mississippi and South Carolina. Events in South Carolina directly shaped the outcome of the 1876 presidential election. Republicans nominated Rutherford B. Hayes of Ohio, who ran against the Democrat Samuel J. Tipton, New York's governor. By 1876, only South Carolina, Florida, and Louisiana were still controlled by Republicans, and the election was so close that whoever carried those three states, which both parties claimed to have won, was going to become president. Does this ring any bells with the dangling chads on the ballots a few years ago? Congress tried to resolve this impasse by appointing an electoral commission which, with a Republican majority, decided that Hayes had carried the critical southern states and been elected. But to secure the result, behind the scenes, Republicans negotiated with the Southern Democrats of South Carolina, Florida, and Louisiana. And they agreed to recognize the Democratic control of the South and refrain from future federal interference in Southern affairs. Uh-oh. They did promise to respect black rights. And if you give us our vote, we will remove the federal troops from your area. It became known as the Bargain of 1877, or the Compromise of 1877, or the Corruption. Hayes quickly ordered federal troops to stand down and allowed Democrats in Louisiana and South Carolina to occupy the state governments there. Gee, here's the former states again, Reconstruction. And the date of the readmission to the Union, see, 73, 74, 76, 75, 70. See, Tennessee, I think, was the only, I thought Tennessee came back in, yeah, 1866. Not good. You got the solid South again. And this is the presidential election of 1876. As you can see, Democrats are coming back. Whereas the last map we saw, there was only 3 states. Now look at the states. But then Oregon has turned Republican. New York is still Democrat. It's weird, right? Reconstruction had defined an American adjustment to the end of slavery and continued long after 1877. But a distinct period in which Republicans controlled much of the South, blacks held some political power, and the federal government protected the basic rights of all American citizens, and it came to an end in 1877. Only a century later, in the civil rights era of the 1950s and 1960s, which we also get into, would the federal government finally act to secure the rights of all, regardless of the race. So we leave the Reconstruction era and venture into what's going to be called the Gilded Age. But before we do, I want to introduce you to another teacher who has a rather unique perspective on how to tell you about things. This is Mr. John Green. He's not quite as out there as Hugh Johnson is, but he has a rather interesting perspective. I think you'll find him amusing because he a lot of times associates things in the past with things that are going on today. I think you'll like him. Thank heavens for ads,
Jim
right?
Watson, Hi, I'm John Green. This is Crash Course U.S. History, and huzzah! The Civil War is over! The slaves are free! Huzzah! That one hit me in the head? You're dangerous, Crash Course. So when you say don't aim at a person, that includes myself? The roller coaster only goes up from here, my friends. Huzzah! Mr. Green, what about year of Reconstruction? Oh, right. Stupid Reconstruction, always ruining everything. So after the Civil War ended, the United States had to reintegrate both a formerly slave population and a formerly rebellious population back into the country, which is a challenge that we might have met, except Abraham Lincoln was assassinated and we were left with Andrew, I am the third worst president ever Johnson. I'm sorry, Abe, but you don't get to be in the show anymore. So Lincoln's whole post-war idea was to facilitate reunion and reconciliation, and Andrew Johnson's guiding Reconstruction principle was that the South never had a right to secede in the first place. Also, because he was himself a Southerner, he resented all the elites in the South who had snubbed him, and he was also a racist who didn't think that blacks should have any role in Reconstruction. Trifecta! So between 1865 and 1867, the so-called period of presidential Reconstruction, Johnson appointed provisional governors and ordered them to call state conventions to establish new, all-white governments. And in their 100% whiteness and oppression of former slaves, those new governments looked suspiciously like the old Confederate governments they had replaced. And what was changing for the former slaves? Well, in some ways, a lot. Like Fisk and Howard universities were established, as well as many primary and secondary schools, thanks in part to the Freedmen's Bureau, which only lasted until 1870, but had the power to divide up confiscated and abandoned Confederate land for former slaves. And this was very important because to most slaves, land ownership was the key to freedom, and many felt like they'd been promised land by the Union Army, like General Sherman's Field Order 15 promised to distribute land in 40-acre plots to former slaves. But that didn't happen, either through the Freedmen's Bureau or anywhere else. Instead, President Johnson ordered all land returned to its former owners, so the South remained largely agricultural, with the same people owning the same land, and in the end, we ended up with sharecropping. Let's go to the thought bubble. The system of sharecropping replaced slavery in many places throughout the South. Landowners would provide housing to the sharecroppers. No, thought bubble, not quite that nice. There you go. Also tools and seed, and then the sharecroppers received, get this, a share of their crop, usually between a third and a half, with the price for that harvest often set by the landowner. Freed blacks got to control their work, and plantation owners got a steady workforce that couldn't easily leave because they had little opportunity to save money and make the big capital investments in, like, land or tools. By the late 1860s, poor white farmers were sharecropping as well. In fact, by the Great Depression, most sharecroppers were white, and while sharecropping certainly wasn't slavery, it did result in a quasi-serfdom that tied workers to land they didn't own, more or less the opposite of Jefferson's ideal of the small, independent farmer. So the Republicans in Congress weren't happy that this reconstructed South looked so much like the pre-Civil War South, so they took the lead in Reconstruction after 1867. Radical Republicans felt the war had been fought for equal rights and wanted to see the powers of the national government expanded. Few were as radical as Thaddeus Tommy Lee Jones Stevens, who wanted to take away land from the Southern planters and give it to the former slaves, but rank-and-file Republicans were radical enough to pass the Civil Rights Bill, which defined persons born in the United States as citizens and established nationwide equality before the law regardless of race. Andrew Johnson immediately vetoed the law, claiming that trying to protect the rights of African Americans amounted to discrimination against white people, which so infuriated Republicans that Congress did something it had never done before in all of American history. They overrode the presidential veto with a 2/3 majority, and the Civil Rights Act became law. So then Congress really had its dander up and decided to amend the Constitution with the 14th Amendment, which defines citizenship, guarantees equal protection, and extends the rights in the Bill of Rights to all the states, sort of. The amendment had almost no Democratic support, but it also didn't need any, because there were almost no Democrats in Congress on account of how Congress had refused to seat the representatives from the new all-white governments that Johnson supported. And that's how we got the 14th Amendment, arguably the most important in the whole Constitution. Thanks, Thoughtful. Oh, straight to the mystery document today? All right. The rules here are simple. I guess the author of the mystery document and try not to get shocked. All right, let's see what we got today. Section 1. Be it ordained by the police jury of the parish of St. Landry that no Negro shall be allowed to pass within limits of said parish without special permit in writing from his employer. Section 4. Every Negro is required to be in the regular service of some white person or former owner who shall be held responsible for the conduct of said Negro. Section 6. No Negro shall be permitted to preach, exhort, or otherwise declaim to congregations of colored people without a special permission in writing from the president of the police jury. Gee, Stan, I wonder if the president of the police jury was white. I actually know this one. It is a black code, which was basically legal codes where they just replaced the word slave with the word Negro. And this code shows just how unwilling white governments were to ensure the rights of new free citizens. I would celebrate not getting shocked, but now I am depressed. So, okay, in 1867, again over Johnson's veto, Congress passed the Reconstruction Act, which divided the South into 5 military districts and required each state to create a new government, one that included participation of black men. Those new governments had to ratify the 14th Amendment if they wanted to get back into the Union. Radical Reconstruction had begun. So in 1868, Andrew Johnson was about as electable in the U.S. as Jefferson Davis, and sure enough, he didn't win. Instead, the 1868 election was won by Republican and former Union General Ulysses S. Grant. But Grant's margin of victory was small enough that Republicans were like, man, we would sure win more elections if black people could vote, which is something you hear Republicans say all the time these days. So congressional Republicans pushed through the 15th Amendment, which prohibited states from denying men the right to vote based on race, but not based on gender or literacy or whether your grandfather could vote. So states ended up with a lot of leeway when it came to denying the franchise to African Americans, which of course they did. So here we have the federal government dictating who can vote and who is and isn't a citizen of a state, and establishing equality under the law, even local laws. And this is a really big deal in American history because the national government became, rather than a threat to individual liberty, the custodian of freedom, as radical Republican Charles Sumner put it. So, but with this legal protection, former slaves began to exercise their rights. They participated in the political process by direct action, such as staging sit-ins to integrate streetcars, by voting in elections, and by holding office. Most African Americans were Republicans at the time, and because they could vote and were a large part of the population, the Republican Party came to dominate politics in the South, just like today, except totally different. Now, Southern mythology about the age of radical Reconstruction is exemplified by Gone with the Wind, which of course tells the story of Northern Republican dominance and corruption by Southern Republicans. Fortune-seeking Northern carpetbaggers seen here, as well as Southern turncoat scalawags, dominated politics, and all of the African American elected leaders were either corrupt or puppets or both. Yeah, well, like the rest of Gone with the Wind, that's a bit of an oversimplification. There were about 2,000 African Americans who held office during Reconstruction, and the vast majority of them were not corrupt. Consider, for example, the not corrupt and amazingly named Pinckney B.S. Pinchback, who from 1872 to 1873 served very briefly in Louisiana as America's first black governor, and went on to be a senator and a member of the House of Representatives. By the way, America's second African American governor, Douglas Wilder of Virginia, was elected in 1989. Having African American office holders was a huge step forward in terms of ensuring the rights of African Americans, because it meant that there would be black juries and less discrimination in state and local governments when it came to providing basic services. But in the end, Republican governments failed in the South. There were important achievements, especially a school system that, while segregated, did both black and white children. And even more importantly, they created a functioning government where both white and African American citizens could participate. According to one white South Carolina lawyer, we have gone through one of the most remarkable changes in our relations to each other that has been known perhaps in the history of the world. That's a little hyperbolic, but we are America after all. It's true that corruption was widespread, but it was in the North too. I mean, we're talking about governments. And that's not why Reconstruction really ended. It ended because, one, things like schools and road repair cost money, which meant taxes, which made Republican governments very unpopular because Americans hate taxes. And two, white Southerners could not accept African Americans exercising basic civil rights, holding office, or voting. And for many, the best way to return things to the way they were before Reconstruction was through violence. Especially after 1867, much of the violence directed toward African Americans in the South was politically motivated. The Ku Klux Klan was founded in 1866, and it quickly became a terrorist organization targeting Republicans, both black and white, beating and murdering men and women in order to intimidate them and keep them from voting. The worst act of violence was probably the massacre at Colfax, Louisiana, where hundreds of former slaves were murdered. And between intimidation and emerging discriminatory voting laws, fewer black men voted, which allowed white Democrats to take control of state governments in the South and returned white Democratic congressional delegations to Washington. These white Southern politicians called themselves redeemers because they claimed to have redeemed the South from Northern Republican corruption and black rule. Now, it's likely that the South would have fallen back into Democratic hands eventually, but the process was aided by Northern Republicans losing interest in Reconstruction. In 1873, the U.S. fell into yet another not quite great economic depression, and Northerners lost the stomach to fight for the rights of black people in the South, which, in addition to being hard, was expensive. So by 1876, the supporters of Reconstruction were in full retreat, and the Democrats were resurgent, especially in the South. And this set up one of the most contentious elections in American history. The Democrats nominated New York Governor and NYU Law School graduate Samuel Tilden. The Republicans chose Ohio Governor and Kenyon College alumnus Rutherford B. Hayes. One man who'd gone to Crash Course writer Raoul Meyer's law school, and another who'd gone to my college, Kenyon. Now, if this election had been based on facial hair, as elections should be, there would have been no controversy. But sadly, we have an electoral college here in the United States, and in 1876, there were disputed electoral votes in South Carolina, Louisiana, and of course Florida. Now, you might remember that in these situations there is a constitutional provision that says Congress should decide the winner, but Congress shockingly proved unable to accomplish something. So they appointed a 15-man electoral commission, a super committee if you will, and there were 8 Republicans on that committee and 7 Democrats, so you will never guess who won. Kenyon College's own Rutherford B. Hayes. Go, lords and ladies! And yes, that is our mascot. Shut up. Anyway, in order to get the presidency and win the support of the super committee, Hayes's people agreed to cede control of the South to the Democrats and to stop meddling in Southern affairs, and also to build a transcontinental railroad through Texas. This is called the Bargain of 1877 because historians are so good at naming things, and it basically killed Reconstruction. Without any more federal troops in southern states and with control of southern legislatures firmly in the hands of white Democrats, the states were free to go back to restricting the freedom of black people, which they did. Legislatures passed Jim Crow laws that limited African Americans' access to public accommodations and legal protections. States passed laws that took away black people's right to vote, and social and economic mobility among African Americans in the South declined precipitously. However, for a brief moment, the United States was more democratic than it had ever been before, and an entire segment of the population that had no impact on politics before was now allowed to participate. And for the freedmen who lived through it, that was a monumental change, and it would echo down to the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 1960s, sometimes called the Second Reconstruction. But we're going to end this episode on a downer, as we are wont to do here at Crash Course U.S. History, because I want to point out a lesser-known legacy of Reconstruction. The Reconstruction Amendments and laws that were passed granted former slaves political freedom and rights, especially the vote, and that was critical. But to give them what they really wanted and needed, plots of land that would make them economically independent, would have required confiscation, and that violation of property rights was too much for all but the most radical Republicans. And that question of what it really means to be free in a system of free market capitalism has proven very complicated indeed. I'll see you next week. Crash Course is produced and directed by Stan Muller. Our script supervisor is Meredith Danko. The associate producer is Danica Johnson. The show is written by my high school history teacher, Raoul Meyer, and my...
Wow. Mr. Green is something else. I kind of like him. And he talks faster than I do, which makes it nice. Now, you've read your text, and you've listened to my lecture. And they say repetition is one of the best parts of learning. Once you have listened to the lecture and read your text and you feel comfortable, go ahead and work your quiz and your 2 essay questions. They are timed. You can only open them and go in one time. Your quiz, 15 questions in 30 minutes, and your 2 essay questions, 2 questions in an hour. Make sure you have your notes and your text. They're close to your computer when you're doing your work, and you should have no problem. You can go in and out of the lecture, of course, as many times as you want to. You can stop it and start it anytime you want to. And if you have any questions about anything on the lecture or what you found in the text, email me, and I'll get back to you as quick as I can. Meanwhile, thank you for listening.